Hey guys, this is Alexei from Mugen Coder, and I'm here to show you how variables work in Mugen. So I have a copy of Kung Fu Man here, just called KFM var, and I'm going to be using him for this tutorial. Nothing has been changed. I'm just going to be modifying his code to show you how variables work. Well, before we get started with Mugen, you have to understand what a variable is. In coding languages like C, Java, and Flash, and others, they all have variables, which are basically places in memory that store data. Data can be pretty much anything, from a number to a string to an object, whatever. So, in normal programming, or regular programming, whatever you want to call it, you have to specify a data type, and then you give the variable a name, like name, and then you give it a value. And with a different variable type, you might be able to specify, you might have to specify var. It depends on the language, really. I mean, this is only for example. This is not Mugen code whatsoever. It's merely pseudocode to show you how variables work and what they are. So let's make another var called time. It'll be a number type and give it 0. And a double type called my double, or my float. And we'll give this a number of 1.2f. I mean, basically, these are variables. It's code that will store a value. So you have a name that stores a value, a string called name. And then this variable, the name of it is time, and then it stores a value of 0. And this is a variable type double, or float, and this will store 1.2f as its value. You may be wondering why I'm showing you this in a different language, and it has nothing to do with Mugen. Well, actually, it has a lot to do with Mugen, in the sense that variables in Mugen, they don't work like this. They do in a sense, but overall they don't. You don't have to specify a data type. You aren't going to be giving it a name. All you're going to be doing is storing values, storing data. And with that said, let's get started. So here I am in Fighter Factory, and I'm going to be basically showing you how variables work. In CNS, there is a state controller called varset. Now, there's a couple of ways to do this, but I'm going to show you varset first. So, simple state controller header, state 195, call it varset, type is varset, trigger 1 is whatever, not time for now. And I'm going to say v equals 0 and value equals 1. Now what this is a variable. This defines a variable. At time equals 0, or not time, this variable 0 will be set as 1. It will get a value of 1. So v is the variable number, and value is the value of the variable. Now, another way of setting variables is through varset as well, but you would do it just simply as this. Same exact thing, except this time I've changed it to var0 equals 1. That means the same thing. I don't have to specify v, and I don't have to specify value. I'm specifying it all on the same line. I'm saying var0 is equal to 1. Now, before I showed you that there was data types, and I showed you that there's names for variables. There are no data types per se in Mugen. There are only floating point values and integers. Those are the only variable types you can store, the data types you can store. And you don't have to really specify which, in the sense that you have to write int or float. You don't have to write that before a variable. All you have to do is specify either var or fvar for float, respectively. And that's it. That's all there is to variables. But you may be wondering, what can I actually do with variables? Or how many are there? Do I have an unlimited amount to use? Well, I'll answer the second question first. And that's pretty simple. There is a limited number of variables you can use. And that would be for integer variables or regular vars. You can go from var 0 to var 59. Now, basically, you have 60 variables to work with here. And then for floating point values, or variables rather, you have from 0 to 40, or 39 rather, and that's 40 variables. Now, this is more than anybody's ever going to need, but it's important to know how many exist, because you don't want to use the variable 60, you don't want to use variable fvar 41, 42, 43, because they don't exist. You won't be able to get anywhere, and Mugen will probably error out if you do. So basically what you want to do is just keep that in mind. Bear in mind that that is your limit. 60 for integer variables and 40 for floating point variables. Now, up here in the data section of KFM, or your character, you'll see int persist index and float persist index. Basically what this means is that you're setting essentially a threshold, and this threshold is important because variables are reset after each round, but variables within this index, within this threshold if you will not be reset to 0 between their rounds or matches, as it says right here. I mean, this is straight from ElectByte themselves. They've put this comment here, not I, and it's exactly what it says it does. Now, this is useful because you might be coding something where you need your variable, where your move is very dependent on your variables, like ammo, for example. Let's say you're coding ammo into your character with a gun, and you fire 3 times, and the 3rd shot kills the enemy. Okay? The round restarts. Now, without this, your bullets, your variable, would be reset to 0, and you wouldn't have any bullets. And that really doesn't make sense. I mean, your gun wouldn't just empty itself as the round ended. You wouldn't, dump the magazine out and just call it a day. You would have the same amount of bullets in the gun as you left the previous round. So this is very important. Most of the time you don't have to change these. It'll be defaulted to 60 and 40. If you ever do need to reduce this threshold or use a variable that does get reset in between rounds, then you would just change this to something like maybe 59 instead of 60, and what happens is then you could use variable 59 as a reset variable that gets reset after each round, and you'd be able to have it reset then. It would reset to 0 once the round ended. Only variable 60. So you need to just keep that in mind. Now, variables cannot be really seen. It's not a graphical thing, it's all code. That's all it is. If I run Kung Fu Man right now, you'll see that nothing has changed. It's just a basic Kung Fu Man, nothing important here at all. But variables are very useful because you can use them to store data that you're going to be using throughout your code in a different way. Now, let me show you what I mean. Basically, I'm going to take his taunt, and I'm going to make Kung Fu Man just fade out during his taunt using a variable. Now, of course, you can do this without variables, and it's probably best too, but for the sake of this tutorial, I'm going to be using variables to do this. So I'm going to start off with a var set, where I'm going to be setting after a certain amount of time. Let's just say 10 and I'm going to change its change state actually to be time greater than equal to 1,000 just for now. Or you know what? I'm not even going to have him change state. He'll be stuck in the taunt whenever he taunts. This is only for the tutorial. So after 10 seconds, I'm going to set var 0. Actually, I'm going to change this to something odd like var 17. I'm going to set this to 256. Actually, I'll say time equals 10. After time equals 10, this var 17 will be set to 256. In order to make things fade out, you do it with trans, the trans state controller. And that works like this. Type equals trans, trigger 1 equals whatever. I'm going to just say time greater than or equal to 10. And now you specify a trans. You can trans add, sub, add 1, whatever. I'm going to do add alpha. And then I'm going to specify an alpha of var 0 and 256. Now, if I run this, it's going to show Kung Fu Man for 10 ticks as non-transparent, completely opaque. And then after that 10 milliseconds ticks is up, it's going to set var 17 equals to 256, and it's going to use this variable. I should write 17 here and not 0. It's going to use this var 17 here to set his transparency, his alpha, to 256. So that's going to be the same as just add. And you can see that now.
Fight.
So when I taunt, you see how he becomes transparent? And he's looping his animation because I haven't told him to just do that. I haven't disabled his behavior. What I have disabled is the change state over here, which keeps him from going into the next state. He's just going to continue to loop this animation for now. Okay, so that's pretty useless to us. I mean, it doesn't take us anywhere. So let's take it to the next level. I'm going to write another type of var set here, but it's not going to be a var set actually. It's going to be a varadd. This is another type of variable state controller, variable related state controller, that does exactly what it says it does. It adds a value to whatever variable you specify. So I'm going to do trigger 1 equals time greater than, let's do 40 for now. And I'm going to say v equals 17, value equals 256. Now, to the best of my knowledge, I don't believe you can do this with a varadd because it doesn't really make sense that you'd be able to do this. You know, it seems like for this you'd be setting the variable. I'd set var 17 as 256, when in fact what I want to do is add to it, and this is not going to get me that. If I wanted to add to it, I'd do something like var 17 plus 1, whatever, but I wouldn't be using a varadd for this anyways. I would just use a var set and, you know, put it in that. But for now, I'm going to use varadd to show you how it works. So v equals 17, and value is going to be equal to, let's say 1, or actually minus 1. I want to subtract from var 17 1 every tick when time is greater than or equal to 40. So now we have initially var set 256 is equal to var 17. Now we're setting transparency to be var 17. So currently at time equals 10, var 17 is going to be 256, and this value for add alpha, or alpha, is going to be also 256. Then, when time is greater than or equal to 40, we're going to add -1 to var 17, or subtract 1 from var 17. So, at time 41, you're going to have 255, and then time 42, 254, and you see how how it'll decrease. And that will essentially make him more and more transparent as time goes on. And you can see this here. See how he's starting to fade out until he eventually is gone? He's gone from the screen. And basically var0 is past, var17 is past 0. He's not visible anymore because we've set his alpha to be 0. We've set his alpha to be var17, which is now 0 because it has decreased over time. And that's what varadd does. So that's how you fade out things. You could fade out helpers, you could fade out characters, whatever. This is how you would do it. This is one way of doing it. You don't have to do it this way. I would probably do it with time instead of using variables at all. Because variables, while they are extremely useful, they do use memory. You are basically setting a place in memory to hold data that you're going to be using at another time. Whether that's immediately or some other time, it doesn't matter. The point is that you're using memory to hold this variable. If you don't use variables, that memory is free and you can do other things with it. Naturally, your character's going to run a little faster. But the change is so negligible that you really wouldn't have to worry about it. So my advice to you as to whether you should use a variable for something or not is only use variables if you absolutely need them. And that's going to be for, complex things that you want to code and you can't really figure out how. Chances are a variable can help you out in many ways because you can store a value and use it at another time. So this is actually very messy code right now. I'm not happy with this at all. So I'm going to shorten it a bit, and I'm going to show you how, using same, variable statements, and only just changing the look of it, changing the way it works. Now, I mentioned at the beginning of this tutorial that varset is one way of setting a variable, and it makes sense because, you're setting a variable with varset. Makes sense. Another way is with null, and I'll show you that now. Okay, so I'm going to put another state controller up here, 195. I'm going to call this one also varset, varset by null. This name can be anything, by the way. It can even have spaces in it. It just doesn't matter. As long as you have something descriptive there that tells you, it helps you and other developers figure out what this is supposed to do. So type equals null. Trigger1 equals, I'm going to say trigger1 equals time equals 10. And I'm going to say, and var17 is equal to 256. Okay, and that alleviates the need for this, and it's much shorter. So what does this do now, you may be asking? Time equals 10, and var17 is equal to 256. It's the same thing, essentially. Null does absolutely nothing, and that's why it's called null. It does nothing. It's there for mostly, commenting out controllers you don't need, like this. I can set it to null. I've done that actually down here with my change state, and that's what I use null for here. But I'm using null in a different way. Since I know it does nothing, I know that anything I put here is going to be completely reliant on triggers. Now, why would I want to trigger something that does nothing? Well, because what actually is happening is I'm setting a variable inside of the trigger, and this can be done like this. So time equals 10 is essentially my trigger 1. I'm saying at time equal 10, do this. So then I'm saying time equals 10 and var17 is equal to 256. Now I added this little colon here. Colon equals is my new operator for this because equals is for comparison in triggers. See, I'm in a trigger right now. I'm in trigger 1. And if I use equals, I'm basically checking to see if var17 has the value of 256. I'm not setting it to be that value, I'm only checking. So basically, this will return true. This will trigger essentially if time equals 10 and if var17 is equal to 256. Now that's not what I want. I want this to just say trigger when time equals 10 and then set my variable to be 256. And you can do that with this assignment operator, it's called. I'm assigning this value to this variable. And likewise, this can work with floating point variables too. It's the same thing. You just do fvar 17 equals 256.0 or whatever. And since I'm using var 17, I'm doing the same thing. So now I have this, and this does nothing again because I'm using null. But the end result is that var 17 is set to 256 and everything is unchanged. I've only made this a little shorter. Now, you may be wondering also why this happens. I mean, I know I like to figure out why things happen, and I'm going to tell you. Basically, when M.U.G.E.N parses this code, your triggers are evaluated in an order. And because I'm using this end operator, or end, I think it's just called end, I'm saying time equals 10 and var 17 equal to 256. So now this happens because of this. You have time equals 10, which will be evaluated first. If time is not equal to 10 at this time when it's evaluated, it won't happen. You know, this is not going to happen anymore. It won't reach this far. However, if time is equal to 10, it will see that this returned true, that time is equal to 10, in fact, and then it will continue to evaluate this statement. It'll say, okay, and var 17 is equal to 256. It knows that this is the assignment operator, and it will assign 256 to var 17. And that's it. That's all you need to know for this. I mean, it's pretty simple. Now, you can also take this varadd and throw it into my var set by null trigger over here as well. In a different way though. So I'm going to do a different trigger, not trigger 1, because I don't want this trigger to have anything to do with this one. I only want it to evaluate on its own line at a different time. And I'm basically just going to copy this, you know, same premise. Time is greater than or equal to 40, and var 17 equals assignment operator equals var 17 minus 1. And that alleviates the need for this. So you have time greater than or equal to 40. If this is true, then continue evaluating, and it will set var 17 equal to itself, var 17 minus 1. So it's the same thing as varadd with -1 as a value, and all you really need to know is that that's what this does. Var 17 is equal to itself minus 1. And itself is going to be whatever value it is. You know, it's going to be 256, 255, 254. Whatever value it has, subtracted by 1, will be reassigned to var 17. So I'm using var 17, subtracting 1 from it, and setting it back to itself. And that may seem confusing, but it really isn't. All you have to know is that I'm using the variable, subtracting 1 from it, and assigning it back to itself. And now the final value of var 17 is going to be this. Okay, so this is the way it should be done actually. I did it wrong before, but this is correct now after some testing. So the first trigger 1 is going to be evaluated first. All other trigger 1s underneath it will not be evaluated if this returns false. See, what was happening before, and that's a great example of trial and error. Basically, I had an error, so I did some trials and I found the issue. And basically what was happening was var17 was continually being set to 256 because it was on the same line and it was evaluating actually the entire line. So I did some testing and I split it up into this, where you have trigger 1, trigger 1, trigger 2, trigger 2. Trigger 1, the first trigger 1 will be evaluated. If this is true, then the second trigger 1 will be evaluated. And that's where your variable set would go, the var set. Just assigning 256 to 17. Then the same concept applied here. I'm taking trigger 2 and I'm saying, is time greater than or equal to 40? If so, if this is true, go to the next trigger 2. And this trigger 2 says take var17, set it to var17 minus 1, and that's it. And you can see it has the same exact result as before in a shorter amount of code. See? Kung Fu Man disappears. So that's just one example of how variables can be used. There are far more complex examples that I can show you. Actually, I will open up one of my Naruto Mugen characters that I work on, and I'll show you how I've utilized variables with them. Sasuke. Sasuke. Okay, basically, this is my Sasuke. You'll see this fire particles on Sasuke when he's hit with Katon Gokaki no Jutsu, and it basically is controlled with a variable and a helper. So I'm going to show you how that works. First of all, right off the bat, I have a helper called fire particles helper, and I'm giving it a blank animation I created, so it doesn't have any animation. It's just empty. It's just empty space. Nothing is there. It has a time of -1, so it never ends, and it has a non-existent animation there in the anim file. I'll show you here. Blank 99999. Or rather 4 nines, and you have group -1, index 0, time equals -1. So that's what this is for. Anim, nothing. You don't need really. You don't need a move type. You don't need a physics. You don't need a state type. None of that really matters here because it's just a helper that it doesn't have a mass. All it does is spawn exploits. Now, basically, here, right off the bat, I'm setting a variable. So I'm using var set here, trigger 1 equals 1. I want this to be set all the time to something random. So 1 minus randomized 3 times 0.1. And that's what my fvar is going to be equal to. This returns a floating point, and it's setting it to fvar equals fvar 0. Now, I should mention that helpers, like this one, have their own set of variables. So your root, or your main character, has 0 to 59 for integer variables, and 0 to 39 floating point variables. Helpers have the same thing. They don't share variables. If I set var 0 in the root, that means that the helper is not going to be reading var 0. It has its own var 0 that it can use. So just keep that in mind. Also, you should probably note that you don't want to use the same numbers. For example, if my helper is going to use var 0, now, I mean, this isn't entirely important. It's just to avoid most confusion. For me, I don't get confused with things like this, so it doesn't matter to me. But for beginners and people who are just getting into Mugen and just getting into the coding parts of Mugen and variables, you're going to probably want to use a different variable number for your helper and a different variable number for your root, provided you were actually using a variable for your root and a variable for your helper. But for this example, for this move actually, I've coded it as var is fvar0. And I have an assert special, pause set. So here we go. Here are more variables being used throughout this entire thing. There are variables everywhere. And it's basically the same variable. fvar0 is used for scale on the xplod. It generates a random scale for the xplod in between a very small, insignificant number that is floating point. It's between like 1 and 1.3, I'd imagine. Actually, no. It would be in between 0.7 and 1. And that's what this is about. That's what this generates. 0.7 and 1. So fvar0, it's used here in the scale. Now, I'm using here another variable, var10. Now, var10 is not set anywhere in here. So I'm using the roots var10. This is what I meant by helpers use a different set of variables. My root, or my main character Sasuke, is going to be using var10. And var10 is in the root. So I'm using trigger redirection here. Root, comma, var10, and that is my value. I'm saying do this pause set if player ID exists, root var10, and basically that's it, just root var10. And if this is true, if the player with that ID does exist, then set the X to the player's position X and that player's position Y. And same here. Only trigger these xplods if player ID exists, same exact trigger. I'm setting floor divided by 2. Basically, I'm taking the player ID's height, dividing it by 2, and flooring it and making it negative. It basically puts it right in the center of them for most smaller characters. For larger characters, it's probably going to be around their waist area, and it really just depends on the height that was set in the data, because, you know, not everyone sets that correctly, and if it's wrong, it'll just be reflected that way. But for most of these smaller characters, 60 works, and 60 divided by 2 is 30, and then it's going to be negative 30 for the position Y on these xplods that get spawned. And bind time 18, random. Here, once again, using player ID root var10, I'm taking the player whose ID is my roots var10, and taking const size ground front times 2. I'm taking their front and multiplying it as the random value, so it will only basically surround the width of the character. If the width is set to be wider, then it will reflect that on the actual character. It will, you know, it will show all the particles around that basic width, and that's what this random is for. And then same goes with the height, except I'm taking the full height of that player and placing all the particles up on that height, and all, you know, I'm taking the entire width of the character and the entire height of the character. And then a simple destroy self, you know, if the var10 of the root was not set, kill it. If there is no player ID that exists, kill it. If time is greater than or equal to 100, kill it. If the player ID's move type is hurt, then, or is actually not equal to hurt, then kill it, because it means they've recovered from their hit and they won't be burning anymore. I mean, they technically could be, but for the sake of this, it basically means that when they get up off the floor, the particles will stop spawning on them, so they're not just running around on fire. And then the last trigger here is just player ID root var10 alive not. So basically, if the player ID is not alive, then kill it, because you don't need it on them if they're dead. Otherwise, they'll continue to burn for eternity and not show anything for it except never-ending fire particles on their body as they just sit there. Anyways, so basically, that's practical application of what variables were used for. But before I go, I'm going to show you actually how var10 is used. Because I'm using root var10 here, but you really don't know how it's set. So I'm going to find Katongo Kaku no Jutsu over here, my fire particle helper, And here again, I'm setting var0 and var1 when time is equal to 0. And this is just another example of how I use null with variables, and that's what that's for. I mean, it's extremely useful. Without this, I would need to have two var sets there, and it would be messy and clunky and just annoying. So, I choose to use just a very simple and clean way to do this. So then I have valadds here. Here we go. We have var set. But it's not just a normal var set, it's actually parent var set. Since this itself is a helper, I wanted the root to have this var10. And I'm setting var10 equals to target ID. And this basically just sets the root's variable 10 to hold the ID of my target. So that way the flame particles will only attach to the target it hit. It's not going to hit anywhere else. If you move past the enemy, it's not going to, the fire's not going to latch onto another person. The fire hit one person, well, it could hit multiple, but in this case it's going to hit one person, and that's where the fire belongs, on that person. So this is basically just a way of latching the fire onto them by holding this target's ID in a variable. And this variable is actually in the root because I'm setting the var set of the parent. And the parent is the root because the root spawned this helper, and that makes this helper's parent the root. And that's pretty much it. That's variables in a nutshell. I mean, you can use them for a lot of things. I use them everywhere, but I only use them when I need to. This could not really have been done without helpers. There's no way to really maintain a target ID, upon hitting without maybe spawning a reversal def and exploiting a bug in Mugen, but really I think this was the best way to approach this because I had a previous version of this character before I updated him, and the method I was using, it just wasn't working. Sometimes the fire particles would move around, sometimes they would move over to the wrong person, sometimes, all hell would break loose. And of course, this stuff only happens in simultaneous mode. But that's your introduction to variables. I hope you enjoyed it, and I hope you learned something. If you have any questions, feel free to send me a comment on Mugencoder or PM me on mugencoder.com. I'm basically available all the time and don't mind helping anybody out.